Hi everyone, and welcome to the Small Business Risk Review for August. Slightly different people presenting today. My name's Matt Jackson. I'm the General Manager at Creditor Watch, and today I'm joined by Joe, Creditor Watch's CTO, and he's going to be talking through some of the numbers in a little bit more in depth today. So I'm really looking forward to getting kicked off. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. The reason for today's webinar is that we've increased the frequency of the small business risk review stats being released during COVID. As everyone is aware, things are changing very fast at the moment, and we like to try and keep our users up to date as often as possible. We're also seeing some great trends that are coming out of the data, and we really wanted to share them with you as frequently as possible. You can ask questions today during the webinar. You can enter a question. If it's a nice and easy one, we'll try and answer it along the way. If it's something that's a little bit more in depth or needs a longer explanation, we'll be in touch after the webinar to let you know. There's a recording available of today's presentation at Creditor Watch, creditorwatch.com.au, and you'll also receive an email with the recording in it once it's all finished. There's more webinars on our website also, so please head over to creditorwatch.com.au, and you'll see other small business risk reviews on there, some hot topics around PPSR, insolvencies, safe harbour. So there's been a lot to talk about of late, and you can find more information there. So a little bit about Creditor Watch. Creditor Watch is Australia's leading commercial credit reporting agency. We have over 50,000 customers that all access and contribute data to our bureau. Our core product is Creditor Watch, which is a monitoring and reporting tool, which is obviously extremely useful in a time like this. It allows you to do an upfront credit check of your customers to determine if they're going to be able to pay their bills on time. And as important, credit monitoring allows you to receive up-to-date alerts on your current customers. I feel this is an area that's typically overlooked by credit teams when I'm speaking with them, but I feel that monitoring piece is extremely important. We do have a full suite of products, right from customer origination, which would be our Apply As You online credit application, through to PPSR solutions, in-depth financial risk assessments, if you're looking for some more in-depth and financial analysis on some of your customers, and data washing, portfolio health check, and debtor logic, which is an assessment of your age trial balance, identifying your best and worst customers. So all very, very relevant at the current time. So just a recap of what the Small Business Risk Review is. It's a monthly, at the moment, analysis where we aggregate data, both from public and private sources. Some of the elements, there's 26 elements that go into the Small Business Risk Review, come from government databases such as ASIC, the Australian Business Registry, and Magistrates Courts. And then Creditor Watch also assesses our own database with things like mercantile inquiries, which come from debt collectors, payment defaults, which I feel is our most predictive data element that's sourced from our 50,000 members, and trade payment data, which comes from both corporate and small business customers. Creditor Watch is the only bureau in Australia that gathers trade payment information from both small businesses and large corporate customers. And we do that by having a one-click integration with Xero and MYOB, gathering that small business payment information on a 5-minute cycle. So we're going to talk through some of the stats and some highlights out of the Small Business Risk Review. Joe, can we have a word on payment defaults, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. So a little bit about payment defaults. We've seen the trend during COVID still decreasing. So over the last month, from July to August, we've seen an 8.3% decrease from year on year, so August 2019 to 2020. We've also seen a decrease of 40%. So that trend is still continuing from here. I think a big component of that is, Australians do unite during these times of crisis, and definitely at the moment, just as we have with the recent floodings and the bushfires back in January, we're still seeing that customers are providing some support, some sympathy towards those teams.
And Joe, why are payment defaults so important to take note of during this time?
So look, payment defaults are still one of the earliest warning signs that you can actually provide that a business is struggling from a cash flow perspective. We know from our own stats that if CreditorWatch receives a payment default, there's a 39% chance of likelihood that they would be insolvent in the next 12 months. So from that perspective, it's still extremely important to be lodging those where you feel like you can still make an impact on those businesses, and providing other businesses with those early warning signs that something will be happening.
And Joe, where does CreditorWatch get the payment default information from?
So yes, we did see a 40% decrease, but yeah, as I was mentioning, that it was 98% of our customers do solely use CreditorWatch, so that information is unique to our business and hopefully to our customers as well. So the next component here, so just making sure we're still sharing. Yep, everything looks a lot better. Thanks for those that reported that. So again, the best performing industries in Australia from the days standing, the DSO, the days overdue in terms of payments, haven't changed from last month. They're still the top three. It's the mining, agricultural, forestry and fishing, and electricity, gas and water. You can see there that mining has still stayed relatively consistent from August of 2019. Whereas the agriculture and the electricity sector has seen a 200%, anywhere between a 100 and 200% increase from August of 2019.
It's important to note, I think, that essential services are still performing really well at this time. Obviously, businesses have to typically pay electricity, water and gas simply just to keep the lights on. So we typically see these core services performing well during this time. It's also important to note that things like electricity, gas, waste services, etc., are being used more frequently at the moment by people working from home, where they would typically share the load in an office building. People are consuming more of these services at home whilst they are working from home, especially in lockdown states where there's no freedom to obviously leave your house.
I guess the one thing to highlight here is that you can see the change from July of 2020. All three, while negligible differences, are starting to see some improvement. So it is showing the economy is starting to pick up, which is great considering the duration that so many businesses have had hardship for so long. Moving over to the most impacted industries. So again, from last month, the same three industries are still being affected. So that being the transport, postal, and warehousing, is still paying 90 days overdue. There's been no change since July of 2020 there. What's interesting in the transport industry is that most likely that you might be thinking about, well, people are staying home, online is booming. You'd think that the transport and postal industry would be in that space too, but I think it's there to have to think about the B2B space that specifically dropped dramatically. So when you think about the number of businesses that have had to physically shut down their store and having goods shipped from warehouses to those stores, you can kind of understand why it's been affected so much. If you also have to think about from the courier space, B2B has dropped off as well. Subcontractors have been, and the employees have seen those payment times blow out. The most, I guess, AusPost has been the big winner out of this period, with home deliveries increasing dramatically.
Yeah, I just have to take a walk around the city at the moment, and there's significantly less courier traffic and people delivering parcels. So you can see the impact of that quite quickly. I think it's also important to note that a lot of the courier brands subcontract to drivers. So you can own a franchise or an area in that B2B space, and that's where we're seeing kind of some of those payment term impacts there.
The next section, the next industry is the administrative and support services. So when you have a think about these, we're talking about office workers, receptionists. There's been a lot of redundancies. This also includes recruitment agencies. And as you know, right now, in times of uncertainty, a lot of those components have been affected. There's been a lot of redundancies in those areas as well. So you can kind of understand how the days overdue has blown out to that 90-day period. What's interesting though, that period actually has gone lower. So it was previously 86 last month in July. It's now up to 90, so hitting that threshold.
And I think Victoria remaining in lockdown is also significantly impacting this. Obviously, Victoria is one of our biggest states and our largest contributors to the economy. So I think that will continue to impact whilst payment terms will continue to be slow whilst Victoria remains locked down.
And I guess the last industry, rental, hiring and real estate services. There's some silver linings here. Whilst it's still at one of the worst performing industries at 59 days overdue, we can start to see that that's decreased by 3 days. So last month it was at 62 days. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the economy is picking up. So if you think the rental and hiring, so anything from vehicle hire to truck hire, is a big component there. That has started to increase over time. People are taking a little bit more holidays now as they kind of realize that Australia is going to be the only place you can start taking holidays, and those services are starting to pick up. The real estate industry itself, we're seeing some better clearance rates and more auctions occurring. So we are seeing some positive signs in that industry as well. This is just I think Patrick, our CEO, presented this last month. I won't go into too much detail, but it is something that we're seeing that many CFOs and executives are sharing with their boards and executive committees. It's a great way to understand what's happening across the industry and understanding how each industry has been affected. There's no real surprises there in some of those worst performing. So accommodation and food services have always been one that have typically paid late, even though their payment terms are generally some of the strictest. They're still there at position number 6, while as kind of some of the strong performers, things like manufacturing and healthcare services, there's still quite a bit of demand there, and the economy is slowly starting to progress, get better in those industries. Moving on to court actions. So this is in comparison to August of 2019. You can see that we've had 2 states, New South Wales and WA, that are starting to see some normality kick in. So in comparison to where we were in August of 2019, New South Wales has only seen a 9% drop, and WA has seen a -6% drop. So that 9% in New South Wales is actually a really interesting figure, given that the new laws have bumped up, the new legislation has bumped that minimum requirement to 20,000. So it just goes to show you how many businesses are still struggling out there. So even though that has been bumped up, we're still seeing similar numbers to where we were in August of 2019. Queensland and South Australia have still seen some large reductions at 32% and 25%, and with Victoria being in lockdown, there's been a dramatic decrease at 63%. External administrations, in comparison to August of 2019, have been dropped dramatically. So if you have a look at 943 external administrations in August of 2019, in comparison to last month, we're at 338. It's been quite a significant drop, so a 66% odd decrease there. But the trend is still continuing. There's still many businesses out there. You know, the term zombie companies out there. Many businesses are still trading almost whilst insolvent, and nowhere near as many are actually declaring insolvency.
I think this is a really important point, and some people might be asking why insolvencies are down so much. There's been a lot of talk about government subsidies supporting those businesses that should have naturally failed. Creditor Watch estimates that there's about 5,000 entities that should have gone into administration since February that haven't. So there's obviously a number of those companies that are still able to tick over based on the government subsidies. Now, we know the subsidies have been extended till later in the year, and my gut feeling is that it's very unlikely that subsidies will stop at Christmas time. So we'll probably see that push to Feb or March, I would suggest. So it's important to note that this is something that's going to be bubbling away for a long time. People have talked about the tsunami of insolvencies starting to occur once administrations come back to a normal level, the government subsidies stop, and the thresholds for court actions drops back down. So when that is coming, Joe, do you have any thoughts around when that might be taking place?
So the insolvency laws have been extended out until the 31st of December. So it's quite an interesting one. I sincerely doubt the government would allow insolvency laws to end just over the Christmas period, when so many businesses have or potentially have the capability to have a bit of a comeback, especially in that restaurant food industry, where January is typically one of their biggest peak seasons as well. So it'll be an interesting one to see what happens over that sort of period. The other aspect to this, so if you have a look at the external administrations by state, you can see that external administration has fallen another 30% in comparison to last month. As mentioned, it is almost 60% lower than 2019, but as you can see there, Tasmania is still extremely low, along with ACT and Victoria. Given the lockdowns in Victoria, you'd expect to see that number to be significantly higher than usual. Some other interesting components that have come up during this month is the rental deferment is still set to finish in a few weeks in many states. So South Australia, Western Australia, and Queensland haven't announced any changes. So within the next few weeks should be ending. New South Wales is still set to be ending in October. However, there's been some recent Supreme Court news regarding that commercial evictions won't be allowed for a further 6 months as companies need to negotiate. Now, while this hasn't been placed into legislation, it does mean that you'll need to negotiate with your landlord to get to some sort of agreement. However, the eviction component can still stand, given that there isn't going to be any legislation around that component. Tasmania is the only other one that has seen that extension move till the 1st of December, which I think is some positive news.
Just some final comments on today's webinar from Harley Dale. Harley Dale was appointed as Creditor Watch's chief economist in the last month, so we're really excited to have Harley providing some insights on our data and how he sees that impacting the economy, especially in such an important time. Just some highlights of Harley comments. Harley's comments were that it's clear to see the SME sector struggling to generate cash flow outside of government support. So he sees that as a high risk area moving forward, especially as those government subsidies roll off. Looking at Safe Harbour, he's encouraging the winding back of Safe Harbour to ensure that companies that were due to fail anyway should potentially do so. It's potentially good for the economy, but continuing support for borderline companies to receive some type of subsidy if possible over this time. We obviously want the economy to be back up and running as soon as possible, and for that I think there needs to be some of that natural attrition, but then also the support to ensure people continue to have livelihoods, especially around that small business sector. So it's great to have Harley on board, and we look forward to some more commentary from him over the coming months on this topic.
That's it so far for the webinar. However, we do have a few moments to go through some of the questions that have been posed. So I'll go through some of those easier questions that we can answer quite quickly. If there's any other questions that we haven't managed to get to, we will do so after the webinar finishes. So one of the questions has come from Zubin regarding the energy industry having ceased default listings as part of their statement of expectation. He's wondering if there's any other industries that have stopped defaulting listings and which ones haven't. So energy, water, gas, telecommunications are all considered highly regulated industries. These industries typically have financial hardship programs in place and legally have to provide those programs. So you'll find that those industries would have either stopped or have reduced significantly the default process on those businesses.
Some other industries I've heard about, insurance and some financial services, including banking, have at least put a temporary halt to defaulting to work with debtors through a hardship program. So that will probably continue, I would say, potentially till the end of the year. There are obviously other industries that are companies, private and public companies are doing it on a case-by-case basis. We understand that suppliers are being particularly more relaxed with debtors, especially if there's a nice and clear open line of communication. But there, I think, will definitely be a time where there's a line drawn in the sand and everyone expects commitments to be fulfilled. When that is, I'm not exactly sure at this stage.
And that probably plays well into Nilesh's question here, that's saying, once the job seeker is reduced, are we expecting to see defaults increase? There's a couple of factors that come into this. So with the rental deferments set to finish across many states, the idea that after a 6-month period, I think everyone's got in their minds that September, the end of September is the period where that grace period that everyone's been so helpful for kind of ends, that you probably will start seeing some defaults to increase. However, if you combine that with the fact that the insolvency laws have increased, we might find that some further leniency is actually applied until those laws, those legislation has been changed to allow companies to wind up other businesses. Robert has asked, how significantly does Victoria distort this data? So there's some really interesting components there, Robert. What we're finding, obviously, that court actions, we've gone down into state by state, industry levels. We take at the DSO level, so the days outstanding. What you'll find is that the sources of truth we're finding is in those age trial balances, the zero and MYOB data. That information is live and it's a most up-to-date record of how people's books are looking. So from that perspective, we don't believe that it's distorting it as much as we would, as you might think. From our perspective, a lot of these businesses and the DSOs there in all industries have been significantly affected. I think that's just going through these comments, these questions. I think that's it at this stage. So we'll end the webinar there. You can find the webinar up on our website. And as always, if you need to get in touch with us, you've got our number there, our email address, and our website.
Thanks so much for attending, and see you next time.